Many of you have seen this as I have stood and spoke on CNN and all of these national sites, national syndicates talking about this issue where our people were without potable water for more than a month. And so we have to make certain that we aren't confused as to what success is as we build these new stadiums, but yet people don't have this resource that they need. And not only do they not have this resource that they need, it is affecting the communities that have the highest rate of poverty the most. Because one of the things that you don't often hear is when you talk about city planning and city design is that it is never neutral, that it benefits one community over another community, that there are resources that are placed in some communities over other communities. And so when we go to fix the water, when we want the water distributed through our city again, it's not because they aren't suffering because we have a black lever and a white lever or a North Jackson lever where we pull the water and a South Jackson lever, but it is because when these communities were built, the land that was closest to the water treatment facility cost the most. And the people who live the furthest and at the highest elevation are the people who suffer from the generational poverty that we continue to see. So as we move forward, as we talk about these sustainable development goals, it's not only about how we realize the environment that we're in today, where cities like Jackson are dealing with colder winters, hotter summers, and more rain, which is wreaking havoc on our aged infrastructure, but it's also a question of equity. It's a question of how we make certain that communities in South Jackson, that the poor communities are not disadvantaged and not discriminated against in how we think of the future of Jackson today. These are the examples that I want to draw in on so that this is a very tangible concept that I leave you with. I don't just want to leave you with an academic discussion. I want you to think about what are the issues from the communities you live in. And what are you facing? One thing that we're all facing as we talk about poverty, as we talk about the things that poor communities are often faced with, we think about issues like crime. And what you find is wherever you find high poverty, you find high crime. And how do we contribute to this in our structure of governance nationally? We teach our children things like crime doesn't pay. The reality is, crime pays very well. And I'm not just talking about the underground economy, nor am I talking about just simply things like the prison industrial complex. I'm talking about the very upfront and in-your-face economy that we benefit from each and every day. Crime pays the lawyers. It pays the judges. It pays the law enforcement. And some of you can remember a time where we didn't have as much law enforcement as we have today, because you have the city police, and then you have the county police, and then you have the state police, and then you have the federal police, and then you have the secret police, and then you have the secret police who watch the secret police, and then you have prison guards and parole officers and probation officers. You have the companies that contract with the prisons for things like commissary and the phone systems, right? And so all of this is dependent on an over-incarceration of our society. All of this necessitates the conflicts that we see in communities, right? Between the police and the community. And so if we're serious about the notion of better protecting people, and on top of all of this, you know, this economy that we build on this notion of criminal justice, it's not leading to the desired end that we want. We talk about the desire for having safer communities, but the reality is that here in this nation, we have more police than any other nation in the world. We have more people incarcerated than any other nation in the world. Yet and still, we have just about more crime than any other nation in the world. And so as we look inward, as we look at the cry of young people who took to the streets in the wake of George Floyd's assassination saying, listen, we need to focus more on sustainable development goals. We need to talk about how we provide mental health support, how we provide money and resources and opportunity to people. This is something that we have to grab onto and understand that we are working in a way that is the equivalent of insanity. The old adage is to continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result is insanity. And so this is what I mean about making shifts in terms of how we look at wealth and how we look at how we focus our economy in a way that yields safer communities, that yields a better quality of life for the people within our cities. When I thought about coming to speak with you today, and also when I was having a conversation with Sister Abra Fordson before I joined you to kind of just mull over some ideas, I thought about a convening or a discussion that I was a party to a few years back. I was a part of a mayor's leadership institute where we had mayors from all over the globe. In fact, we had mayors not only from various cities within this country, but as far away as Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Britain. And we were in this classroom setting, and we were discussing this particular day about the growing inequities that we're seeing in our society. And as we were going around the room, we were all contributing to what we thought or what we believe was some of the leading contributing factors to that growing inequity. And you had some wonderful contributions, people who were talking about innovation versus workforce, the issues of poverty, the issues of sexism and the inequality in pay for our women. I mean, just wonderful contributions to this discussion. And when the conversation circled around to me, I found myself at a loss because I said, you know, from where I sit, we're approaching this question from the wrong premise. We're approaching the question from the premise that something has gone wrong. And the reality is that we have a system that is operating in the way in which it was always intended to. And if anything, it is overperforming. It is overperforming. And so when we talk about where we go, when we talk about what we must do, we have to understand that we have to advance policies from within our political spaces, within political office, but we have to make the bridge and go beyond that. Because the reality is when we have these discussions about social justice in the wake of the death of George Floyd, it isn't because mayors came together and said this must stop. It's because young people took to the streets. It's because they started to challenge and threaten the economy of this country. They started burning things down. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying as a mayor, right, that I want my community burned down, but what I am saying is that we have to concretize that energy, that we have to learn from young people like the Parkland children, the Parkland students that came to visit me after their school was shot up. And yet we still can't advance common sense gun right legislation that better protects people, right? We have to concretize the energy of those young people that took to the streets, like I said, in the wake of George Floyd's assassination. And so when we think about what we must do, I think of a structural critique, one that my father gave after the election of Barack Obama, right? And before I go into that critique, I will say that in a place like Jackson, Mississippi, I tell people when they ask me how did I feel after the election of Donald Trump, I told them that the Wednesday after Donald Trump was elected president, I felt like I woke up in Mississippi, right? Which means that whether you love Barack Obama, the reality is that if you were poor before Barack Obama, you were likely poor after Barack Obama. If you loved or hated Donald Trump, the reality is that if you were poor before Donald Trump, you were likely poor after Donald Trump. And so we have to understand that we are the cavalry that we've been waiting on. And when we look at things like the limitations of a mayoral office, or we look at the limitations of a presidential office, that critique is much like the analogy of the plantation. You see, on the plantation, you always had an overseer, and that overseer's responsibility was to put enough pressure on the slaves in the field to make certain that they yielded enough crop. And in the early days of enslavement, that overseer was almost invariably always white. And as slavery became more institutionalized within our minds and for our bodies, sometimes that overseer became black, right? And if that overseer was black, maybe he didn't beat you quite as bad. Maybe he beat you worse. But the reality is no matter whether your overseer was white or black, you were no more free. And so your problem was never with the overseer. Your problem was with the plantation itself. And so when we look at who is mayor or who is president, your problem isn't simply who is the president of the United States. Your problem is with the structure of an economic system that allows for people to be oppressed, that allows for people to be a part of generational poverty. And as we deal with the realities of COVID-19, don't be fooled into the belief that conditions have gotten worse because we're dealing with a pandemic. The reality is that we're looking at this is being highlighted for us, what people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis anyway, each and every day. And so as we're talking about stipends that are given to families, as we're talking about how we better support people in the midst of this pandemic, things that people have been fighting for and challenging and promoting for years, you find that we actually live in a world of abundance, but we operate from a place of scarcity. And it is less about the resources that we have to give to people and more about the lack of political will in order to accomplish it. And so how do we do this? How do we revolutionize the way we see electoral politics? But one of the things that we are excited that we have built in Jackson and want to build even stronger, as I said, is 3 minutes on a microphone at a city council meeting does not equal community to participation. So we started building people's assemblies that we have quarterly in different areas of the city. Assemblies where the community can not only receive information from its leadership, but it can also inform its leadership as to the things that are taking place on the ground. It necessitates that while we started them, we can't continue to run them, right? Because it's also a pressure mechanism that ensures that your leadership is holding true to the very principles that allowed you to send them in office in the first place. It also looks like moving towards things like participatory budgeting that we're trying to do in Jackson. Because we understand that for political leadership, one of the principal responsibilities you have is how you manage or how you create a budget. And so budgets are moral documents that should reflect the values of our communities. And so if we are not inviting community into the process, if we're not asking people where they want to see funding going, not only are we not scratching where they may be itching, we are also failing to live up to the principles and the morals for which our community is comprised. Additionally, we have to look at issues like cooperative economics. This notion of how poor people bring their resources together isn't a unique concept, right? We've been facing this challenge for centuries. And so we're looking at adopting old ideas from our heroes and our sheroes, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who organized poor farmers in the Mississippi Delta in order to create a cooperative farmer co-op. And so we're looking at that and expanding on that old idea. You see, Jackson, like many other communities, and I can't speak for Milwaukee, but Jackson is a city which doesn't have a problem producing wealth. It has a problem maintaining wealth. And so all of the dollars that are made between 9 and 5 just happen to be out by 6, right? Where we have businesses that have come and have profited, because Jackson is the largest city in the state of Mississippi by a factor of 3. And so they have no problem coming and profiting in the city of Jackson, but they don't share a reciprocal relationship where they look to invest back in our communities. And so a city that is 3 times larger than the next largest city doesn't even have something as simple as a movie theater within our corporate limits. And so how do we take this notion? How do we learn to fill in our own gaps? And at the same time, leveraging our position so we now make it dangerous not to invest in our communities. And so we can take the notion of cooperative enterprise, and I know that's a scary notion, right? When you start talking about cooperative enterprise, you're called some very scary things, right? Like socialists, right? That's a scary term. Y'all supposed to be scared of that, right? When the reality is, when you look at our world, when you look at this country, there is a shift in terms of cooperative enterprise. When you look at Ace Hardware is actually a cooperative business. If you're a part of a credit union, that's nothing more than a cooperative. If you are heard of Florida orange growers, that is a cooperative. When I had the opportunity to travel to other countries, I went to Barcelona, Spain, and learned how they were doing cooperative housing in order to ensure that people had the security of safe, affordable housing, and they had cooperative homes. How do we expand on this notion so that we can build a cooperative movie theater in Jackson, Mississippi? Understanding when people go to the movies, sometimes they like to enjoy a little meal before they go to eat. If they have a little more time, maybe they want to do a little shopping around the movie theater. And so if we demonstrate that we're able to fill these gaps, that we're able to plug the holes within our own community, it's not simply telling people or telling businesses that, Jackson's a nice place with good people who will spend money. It's leveraging our position so it then becomes dangerous not to invest in Jackson. Or communities just like Jackson, communities around Wisconsin, or communities wherever home may be to you. And so what we ultimately have to come to is the same thing that Martin Luther King began to understand not long before he died. You see, Martin had a conversation with Harry Belafonte not long before he died, where he said, listen, Harry, I believe we're going to win this integration struggle, this struggle against America's apartheid. But he said, I'm beginning to fear, I'm beginning to worry that we may be integrating into a burning house. He said, because I see a system that abuses labor, that abuses working people. And he said that if we can't come to a place where we talk about how people feed their families, then it's senseless to walk Mississippi roads together. It's senseless to talk about these social issues until we come to a place where people are able to share goods, resources, and power. And so ultimately, it's greater than a question of color. It's a question of ideas. And what are the best ideas? And what are the worst ideas? And the worst ideas are that we could allow anyone or any generation to suffer in poverty, any generation to suffer at the hands of discrimination. And so the shift that we must make is a move towards economics for and by the people, as opposed to economics by a few people for themselves. I'm grateful to be here with you today. And I look forward to the discussion and the ability to learn from one another, so that communities like Jackson can stand as a model for our ability to rescue ourselves as we work in combination with you. And so I thank you for the invitation, and I thank you for the opportunity to learn from you. But I come here humbly suggesting to you the words of an indigenous organizer who once said that if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, come let us work together. Thank you very much, and free the land.
Did y'all hear that? We're going to do a Q&A because we have time. I just want to plug the Planning Coalition members that give me the instruction that help me find keynote speakers like Mayor Chokwe Lumumba. We appreciate y'all. Are there any Planning Coalition members in the room? Raise your hand. All right, shouts out. Thank you.
So very proud of that keynote. Serious Mississippi stuff. And by the way, my mother was on the first Delta line at Jackson State. So Mayor, I'm a student of Black mayoral leadership, and I actually did my dissertation on the role that an African-American mayor plays in economic development in a predominantly white city. But that's not your case. So given Maynard Jackson's example of Atlanta, when he first became the mayor and he found himself in a serious power dynamics, he decided to, how can I say this, go up against the white power elites within Atlanta and actually threaten to move all of the city's resources in terms of what they had on account in banks in Atlanta to guess where? Birmingham. What an insult that was. To even suggest that you would take money from Atlanta and move it to racist Alabama and racist Birmingham. So as you sit around your governing table, what resources have you realized that you amass that you can maybe help kind of tilt the balance of economic equity within your community?
All right. First and foremost, thank you, brother, for the question. And that came from a good noob. First and foremost, not only have we looked to build on the lessons of people like Maynard Jackson, and you know, several other Black mayors that dealt with the transition or the transition of wealth into Black communities. We've done things like try to build, and we're building a disadvantaged business program that enables many Black businesses that we may have a lot of people who know how to cook, but don't know how to run a restaurant. An opportunity to be a part of things like a business development program where we have banks that we require them, are going to require them to put skin in the game. The city is going to put skin in the game. And also those businesses have to put some money in so that once they graduate from that program, they have access to operating capital, which often is the challenge with our Black businesses. But let me give you this notion. As we're having a conversation about community and the issues of poverty, I am an unabashed supporter of Black business, right? In fact, I tell people that if 85%, in Jackson is 85% Black, but if 85% of your population is left-handed, right? You need some left-handed jobs, right? And so it's not even just a question of color as it is a question of economics, but I would suggest to you that we can't limit our focus simply to those Black businesses. And the reason that I would say that, because a Black business is like any other business in a capitalist society. It takes advantage of markets. And so that Black business, which may have gotten its upbringing in the Black community, which harnessed it and developed it and allowed it to grow, that Black business may one day pack up its bags to seek, you know, higher pastures or greener pastures, right? And so that's why this notion of cooperative enterprise is so important, because it's the opportunity for a community to own the investments within its community, right, within their neighborhoods. And so it only moves if it works to the advantage of the community, right? Part of its mission is to allow people to not only dictate how they'll labor, but what the fruits of their labor will be. And so I am proud of the legacy that I stand on. I'm proud that I have such a rich history of you know, strong Black mayors that came up and allowed me to stand where I am today. But I would suggest to you that at one point in time, our mission was to get leadership that looked like us. Now our mission must be to get leadership that thinks like us.
Mayor Lumumba, one of the things that made your that attracted us as a planning coalition to you was that number one on your platform as mayor was dignity for the people, putting the people first. Can you just talk about how that became central and the most important thing to you as a mayor?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, and just as much as I lift up and am proud to serve as mayor, I'm proud to be said that I'm a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, right? That is my political home. That is the organization that I grew up in, that raised me and influenced much of the ideology that I have. And so the name of that organization is the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement for Self-Determination and Self-Defense. And so the principle by which I lead is the principle of self-determination. How are we allowing people to have greater access to governance? Or greater control of their governance? How are we allowing people to democratize power and do those things? And so it leans back on those cycles of humiliation. It leans back on the fact that, you know, not even a month into office, I was dealing with the potential takeover of our school district, right? Because of the poor scores within our school district, because of the poor facilities around our school district. It leans on the fact that, you know, not only do I have, you know, a high level of generational poverty, and Mississippi is the poorest state in the country, right? these are cycles of humiliation. These are cycles that, leave children hungry. When we dealt with our first freeze while I was in office that debilitated our water system in late 2017, what we were faced with as we had to shut down schools was that so many of our children depended on those schools to be open so that they could have something as simple as a meal at lunch. And so we had to organize around that. And so that just turns my focus to how people are being humiliated time and time and time again. And so we pat ourselves on the back when we're able to bring in a new business, right? Everybody was fighting for Amazon and all of these things. And that is the market of success that we have historically gone by. But yet and still we stand quietly and sit idly by when we have these conditions taking place in our community each and every day. And so I think that our economy should be based, I should say, on the inherent dignity that every person so justly deserves. And so that's, why I gave the examples of, the stadium and the examples of our criminal justice system is because we often get, derailed or sidetracked in these other objectives that I'm not saying they lack importance, but they certainly aren't as important as whether you have fresh fruits and vegetables in your community or whether you live in a food swamp or a food desert, and the list can go on and on and on and on again, right? If you overlay the map of poverty, you find that those are not only the communities that have those deserts. When we're looking at the heat island effect in our communities, right? We find that those communities are disproportionately affected by the increased heat because they have less foliage in their communities, right? They have less natural resources that protect them and more concrete in their communities. These are things, once again, city planning is never neutral, right? It works to the benefit of someone. And so we have to focus on those things.
Milwaukee over 83 years. I was born here.
I
And
don't
I've
see
seen
I don't see
many-
the person. Can you wave your hand? I just want to look at you. Oh, you're way in the back. Okay, I got you.
And I've seen many changes within our society as far as the economic and the political arena. But there is something that usually is happening that I seem to be similar, and that is there's usually an outside entity controlling directly or indirectly the people in control. And I was wondering, to what degree, if any, have you been able to thwart this kind of interference with getting done what you want to do so that you can really do what the people put you in there instead of the people who want to control you?
So that's the type of question that'll get you killed, Let me say this. I think that to suggest that I have solved that or figured that out on my own would be disingenuous, and I owe you honesty, right? That is why, I lift up not only having leadership that focuses on the policies and espouses the policies that the community wants it to, but I also lifted up the agitation of the community itself and the importance of that. Malcolm once said that in order to achieve liberation, that he needed to be a revolutionary nationalist freedom fighter, that he had to be all of those three things in order to see success take place, right? And so what I learned, and the benefit of my father being in office, my father who was an organizer his entire life, that in actuality, when we moved to Jackson, we were actually more antagonistic towards electoral politics than we were aiming to run for office. And it was an evolution of political strategy, seeing electoral politics as a means to an end as opposed to the end itself, right? That we started to realize that, not everyone's going to come to the community center. And if you can only organize people who think like you, you're not much of an organizer. And so how do we get to these material issues that people are dealing with and use it as a leveraging point to tackle the things that you're talking about so they could have a broader perspective of how global the challenges are and why, it's people behind the scenes who are really controlling things. But we have to also, in that process, have a very clear view of the limitations of political office, because the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? And let me just say that is a real struggle amongst us, right? That is a real struggle amongst, organizers. And we have to have balance in that and not be so politically elite, so revolutionary elite, right? That we're not listening and taking from people who have experience to offer. And in those experience, they're educating us. I'll just end that question with this. When my father ran for office and won, we knew how to campaign. We knew how to get in the community. We knew how to fight, right? What we didn't know was how to win. And so it was kind of an moment, right? About how we organize and who's in office and who's not in office and what work still needed to take place within community with organizations like this.
So I have a quick virtual question and then we'll take another question right here. I really love that quote that at the end and was wondering what the name of that indigenous organizer was.
I didn't say it because I forgot. So I'll try to pass it down. I usually try to remember that because I'm so grateful for the contributions of organizers over time, but I did forget the name. All right. Somebody in the audience might know.
How you doing, Mayor? Welcome to the northernmost Mississippi community in the United States. Question I have for you is, could you give me your reaction to Charles Blow's new book, The Devil We Know, where he proposed as the strategy for African Americans that we leave the northern communities and go back to the traditional homeland of our southern states, and by doing that would dominate the U.S. Senate and Congress for the next century. What's your reaction to that? And as a Southern mayor that would benefit from all of this African American talent coming back to places like Jackson, what's your reaction to Charles Blow's proposal?
So first and foremost, I've had an opportunity to speak with Brother Blow and discuss the book on a virtual panel. But I am the example of his book, right? Originally born in Detroit. Then my father and mother moved us to Brooklyn, New York, where he had a case that lasted for 2 years, where he was representing Mutulu Shakur, Tupac's stepfather, right? And then at the conclusion of that, my parents decided that they wanted to move to the South, not because I have any family there, right? My father was one of 8, his mother was one of 15. I have a huge family. They're all in Detroit, right? My mother is originally from DC. And so we didn't move to Jackson because I had a great aunt there. We didn't move to Jackson because there was some new job opportunity for either one of my parents. We moved there to be a part of this movement. Now, there's a few things that I would say about that. Absolutely, we have to understand the unique opportunity that places like Mississippi provide, right? Not only because Mississippi is the place where the largest concentration of our people live still today. And if you go back in history, you find that prior to the Reconstruction period, Mississippi was about 80% Black, right? And after the terror and the horrors that took place, and let's be real about how that happened, because we focus on things like the Confederacy and all of that, but the reality is, to speak to that book, what took place is that right after the Civil War, Black people were the only people who were eligible to vote, because people who served or were refused to denounce the Confederacy were considered enemies of the state, and they did not have the privilege of voting. And so that's why you have people that rose up in office like John R. Lynch or Hiram Rebels, because what Black people did was what any people would do. Once they got freed, Union soldiers thought that they would be so grateful that they would hang around and they would elect them in the office. And Black people did what any people would do. They elected themselves in the office, right? And so that is when the Union forces pulled back and made agreements with Confederate forces. And that is when you had the rise of the KKK. And that is when, if you were from Mississippi, then likely you went straight up. And that's why you have so many people from Mississippi that have relatives in Chicago. And if you were from Alabama or Milwaukee, if you were from Alabama, your people went straight up, and that's why you have so many people that live in Detroit that are originally from Alabama, like my family. And so, so it's not necessarily. I appreciate the brother's book, but this is a revisiting an old idea, right? And so, as we look at this notion of going back and understanding that if we're able to develop political power in that way, it is also important to understand that you don't come with a notion of political elitism, thinking that people in Mississippi don't understand their conditions. And instead of just simply coming as an educator of the people, you have to come out of willingness to grow and develop and support. It goes back to the quote that I was just asked about. If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, let us work together. That is what I would say, that we have to come. But I would encourage people to come back to the South and be a part of what we're building. Because if you're able to achieve progress in places like Mississippi, then what does it say for the rest of the nation or the world?
Good afternoon and welcome to Milwaukee. My name is Joaquin and I work in housing, so I have a question on housing for you. I think you said, Jackson, 88% African-American, is that correct?
85,
85,
about 85.
About 85, and I just looked up and your homeownership rate in Jackson, Mississippi is about 65%. And in Milwaukee, we're about 42% African-American, and we have one of the lowest rates of homeownership. It's about 26% of African-Americans own. And so right now we're in this frame of mind that we just have to have more home ownership amongst African Americans. But I think we got to look a little bit further than that. So I speak to the mayor of a city that has a much higher rate than the national average. Curious, man, what else should we be thinking about beyond just home ownership? Because I would assume that home ownership alone doesn't create resiliency.
No, home ownership, we shouldn't just be looking to build homes. We should be looking to build community. And you know, what we find in Jackson, and I'm curious about those numbers, because, you know, what we have in Jackson are a number of people who live in homes and have been in homes for many years, but the people who own the houses, right, own those homes, either don't live in the community or aren't invested in the community. And so, you know, I'll say this. I believe in what I am against. I am fundamentally against gentrification, right? I think that gentrification is a war against people, where you move people from one state of misery to the next. And so people who are already dealing with issues of poverty are then shuffled out of the community and further away from the resources that they depend on, whether it's the hospitals, whether it's the job opportunities. And so instead of moving people away, we have to be able to lift people up. And so we have to, you know, re-envision what that notion, and that's why I talked about even cooperative housing ideas, so that we help protect people in their effort to secure better security in their housing. I will say that housing is important though, because there is something that happens to people when they are invested, when they feel that they are getting the best out of life. You know, I didn't grow up in a condition where I was hungry like some of my brothers and sisters. But even when I got a house, I started to look at life a little differently, right? Started saying, well, maybe I need to look into some life insurance. Maybe I need to get some health care. I wanted to stick around a little longer, right? And so when we look at issues of poverty, when we look at what that is connected to, when we see violence, when we see anger, when we see mental health challenges, when we see all of those things, that has a correlation between the experience people are having within our cities, what they are failing to be secured by. It amplifies that. As we've seen, greater insecurity in our world at the hands of this pandemic, that is why we've seen a rise in crime. I challenge, and I'm gonna be reserved in what I say about this because it ended up in a legal proceeding, right? But I knew that once we were faced with this pandemic that I was going to see a rise of violence in my community, because I understand the interconnectivity between poverty and mental health and all of those things and crime, a rise in violence. We've experienced a rise in violence. And so in Mississippi, where we have legislation that allows for open carry, I think that when people are in conflict in their homes, in communities, having a gun brandished in front of everyone or each one another doesn't lead to resolution, right? And people are unable to find permanent solutions to temporary problems. And so there was a subsection of the law that said that it would allow for me to take emergency action to do things like suspend open carry, which I tried to do. And yet someone who didn't live in Jackson, Mississippi, lived 100 miles away, sued me in the state of Mississippi for banning open carry in Jackson, Mississippi. And so I think that it's important that our community be connected to these issues so they understand why that is an effort to literally allow them to kill one another and to just assassinate themselves at high rates. I took your question and went all over the world, but hopefully I touched you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us today. One of the things I want you to understand about SDC is we are an agency and a commission, and we have the power and the mandate to act as advocates for the people that we serve. You were fantastically transparent about your family's decision to go from the activist side of things into the elected official side of things. So I would suspect that gave you, and it provides you some insight that I want to take advantage of. What counsel do you have for us engaging our elected officials in ways that will forcibly encourage real responses, that will invite collaboration, and that will really hold them accountable? We're very fortunate, this is my disclaimer, we're very fortunate that we've had great participation in our programming and support from so many of our elected officials at the city and county and the state level. Thank you all so very much. But there's so much more work to be done. And we need, as a commission, we need to hold them accountable. So advise us how to speak and how to act so that someone in your position has to listen.
Well, I appreciate that question, and I'll try to touch on it. I don't know that I am qualified enough to tell you how to speak and act, in that sense, but I can give you some lessons learned on my end of things. First and foremost, it is important that we become more engaged in the process. Because we've been locked out of political office for so long, we are often unfamiliar with how processes work, right? And that leads to an expectation that we're going to achieve things that structurally that may not even be feasible or even possible unless we change the structure of things. And secondly, it allows us to be in a position that when people are at the table discussing where resources are going, we're not there. And so the old saying is that if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu, right? And so that is something that we have to correct. And that is why, I will tell you, even as I talk about people's assemblies, and participatory budgeting, we get participation depending on what the issue is, but it's not as frequent and as heavily populated as it should be. And if people truly understood the power that they harness by their presence, then they would certainly be there. And so we have to lift that up amongst our people. And I think it's an ongoing engagement. We have to get away from this notion. We tell our children, you got to get out there and vote. You got to get out there and vote. And yes, it is important. But if we're not lifting up the ongoing engagement on a day-to-day basis, then it will render our efforts just as ineffective as they have always been. And so so that's what I would lift up, is that you have first some type of convening that takes place on a day-to-day basis. And what we have with the People's Assembly is not only these quarterly meetings, there is a leadership team that is selected from the assembly that engages and works on subject matter and talks with the leadership on a day-to-day basis, even when the assembly is not meeting. And so that is important. But it ultimately hinges on the fact that often when we elect people, we don't elect the people, we elect people who promise all of the things that they're going to do for us, as opposed to looking in their history. And many times their history will tell the story. If nothing in their history said that they're going to accomplish this, right? If nothing in their history says that they're committed to us in this way, if we're only meeting them around election time, right? Then the likelihood that they're going to be intricately connected to our principles and our values is dramatically low. And so that's where we have to change how we get to even the process of who runs for office. I will tell you, I had no vision of running for office, right? That wasn't my goal. Now, I certainly aspire to always be an asset to my community because that's how I was raised. And for me, selfishly, because both of my parents are now gone, and because they raised me in this way, in my mind, Chokwe and Nubia Lumumba live in the people's struggle. And so long as I'm engaged in that, they will never die, right? And so that's why it's so valuable to me. And I learned that our leadership should come less out of political ambition and more out of necessity. And so that's why I decided to run. But I would just say that presenting yourself in a way that is consistent enough that if you have enough of the constituents that vote them in office on an ongoing basis, then you'll grab their attention. One thing that we did, and stealing from that idea, I hooked up with some mayors during the presidential campaign, where we had all of these presidential candidates that wanted that wanted endorsements from city leadership so that they could win primaries within communities. And so what was important to me is that it wasn't a perfunctory exercise, that we simply say we're endorsing somebody, I get a picture next to you, and then you forget me and my community after you leave that primary. And so what we did was Mayor Benjamin of Columbia, South Carolina, Mayor LaToya Cantrell of New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mayor Randall Woodfin of Birmingham, Alabama, the four of us drafted the Southern Mayor's agenda. And what we agreed to is we may not all endorse the same person, but none of us would endorse anyone who did not accept our agenda for our community. And so you need to do that on a local level and on a national level. You need to establish that agenda so that when they don't live up to it, you got it in black and white. You said, no, when we supported you, you said you were going to do this, right? When we supported you, you said that you were going to stand up for this. And so that's important, because when they think that their success is just a measure of what they have imagined as success and not what you have drafted, then that leaves opportunity for failure.
Got another question from our virtual audience. and that is he willing to run for mayor of Milwaukee? And what are your action plans?
Well, they don't want me to run for mayor of Milwaukee because the first order would be we would outlaw any Green Bay Packer. No, let's not. No, no. Well, I think that I'm certain that you have some strong advocates and people within the community here in Milwaukee, and we need to train our eyes on those individuals and build them up. Prior to running for mayor, I hadn't run for junior class president, junior high president of the student body, and so I was drafted into this, and I'm still a work in progress, and I'm still learning, and so we need to identify those people who show promise and show an interest in the values that the community has.
Do we have a question on that side of the room? We have a question here, and then this will be the last question. So we'll take that question after your question will be the last.
So
Mayor, I think I'm next and then you. Is that how you said it, April? Okay, thank you. Mayor, absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm a former elected official too, so I can relate to what you were saying. You said something that was truly profound when you said the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. What I'd like to ask you is, how would you suggest we get around this, go over it, or sneak under it? How do we sneak up on the master using his tools?
Well, I think that if even as we take that analogy and as we look in a practical sense of what the master values most is his wealth. He values most the ability to profit off of the way that the system is currently structured. And so every possible way that we can educate, agitate, and organize in a way that challenges that ultimately brings us more power. And what we have been subjected to is, reductive logic that sometimes points us, towards one another, where we look at each other as the issue, as opposed to the person who's really profiting. We go back to slavery. If we really think about it, slavery was not only oppressive to the obvious victims of slavery, it was oppressive to poor white people as well. Because if you have a system of industry that is focused on free labor and you have no job, then the only opportunities you have is as that overseer, right? Or no opportunity at all. And so what we were trained to believe is that we were at war with each other just based on race. And so this poor white person, and be very clear that only a small fraction of our population owned slaves. The grand majority were poor. I think there's a movie called Free State of Jones that does a good job of illustrating this, right? And so if we better understood that we were both oppressed, then it would have led to greater action in a unified way to fight this. Even when we think about issues of immigration, we could come here and we say things like, oh, someone's coming here to take our job. The reality is, if it was your job, they couldn't take it in the first place. And the effort is to not only exploit them, but it's moving away from the former type of exploitation that you suffered on to a new form of exploitation, to even exploiting people who are behind bars. And so it's the same notion, the same idea. You have more people behind bars and working than in all of slavery combined. There are more people incarcerated than you had slaves, right? More people who have been incarcerated. And so that is a system that allows to exploit free labor over and over and over again. And so how do we get around that is we take the power of the masses and we challenge that. We challenge where their wealth is. We challenge companies that don't stand up. We challenge companies that feel that it's safe to do so. And that's going to require a lot of education, because one thing you don't want to do, you know, we're always talking about boycotting something, but the most unsuccessful thing you can do is to call a boycott and nobody show up, right? That nobody is educated enough that you know, they realize the importance of what they're doing. Now, if you go through history, and I'm not advocating this, but just to give, just a historical account of how people were held to a standard. You know, they don't tell you when they talk about the boycotts that took place in the South that they had a belt line in the Mississippi Delta, right? And what that belt line meant is if you were caught shopping at that grocery store that we're boycotting, then you're gonna meet us at the gymnasium at a certain hour, right? And you're never gonna do that again, right? And so we have to choose a different methodology of educating. And I think it requires that we understand that organizing looks different in 2021 than it has looked in past years. When young people organize, they like to have music out there, right? They may be dancing. It may look like a celebration, but what we need to do instead of discouraging them is, like I said, concretize, which means take that energy from its mystical place, its mysterious place, and organize it in a way that they learn from our elders, they learn from the lessons that the battles that they had to endure, and then accept some of the ideas that they have. You know, one of the things that I'm most proud of, and this isn't about organizing, but it's about city planning, which once again is a form of organizing. Mississippi, while this reverse migration that the brother was talking about in Brother Blow's book is taking place all throughout the South, where Southern populations are increasing in other states. Mississippi is the only state that that's not happening in, right? While all of the states around us are increasing their population, Mississippi is losing population. And so when we look deep into it and we look at the fact that the state doesn't support cities like Jackson, that we have this ongoing battle, what we have found is that the population that Mississippi is losing at the most significant rate is amongst young people, which is troubling for a number of reasons. One, in a city like Jackson, we have 40,000 college students, right? We have 5 institutions of higher learning. We have Jackson State, Thurgood, Millsaps, Belhaven, University of Mississippi Medical Center, and Hines Community College, right? And so we have an opportunity to audition. But when we're smothered in a way where we don't have the resources, when there aren't job opportunities for young people, then our greatest exports as a city become our talent and our money, right? And so we started to host something that I call the Mayor and the Millennials Roundtable Conversation, where I talk to young people about quality of life issues so that we can learn and focus on how we build the future of Jackson today. And what we learn is that young people like walkable cities. They like public art. They typically like urban environments. And for a place like Mississippi, where Jackson is really the only urban environment, not only is Jackson's success beneficial to us, Jackson's success is Mississippi's success, right? And so I think we have to learn from young people. We have to, going back to the original question, we have to challenge the profitability of those that are in control in different ways. Yeah. Thank y'all we have one more over here, I'm sorry.
I just had a concern and a question, I guess. I like to say that we were placed in poverty. So the people that placed us in poverty obviously wanted us there for whatever reason. So we were in poverty, dealing with the problems and the challenges that comes with it. And we are always told as a community to seek help, seek resources for the stuff that we've been through, stuff that we, done had to overcome. but I never really hear anyone talk about how can we reach the people that placed us in poverty. Because if we're steady changing ourselves to, become better and do good, and we still have to face these same people that already have in their mindset where they want us, then it's just going to be a violent change. So, like, is it possible, do you think, for us to reach those people in a positive light to see if we could change their mindset to be like, hey, why do you think it's okay to just look at somebody's skin and say you're not qualified? Or why did you think it was okay to round up a lot of people and make them work for free, and then years later turn around and be like, no, that we didn't mean it. Y'all could continue to work under the new laws, but still it's a lot of stipulations to it. So I just feel like if the people who have the same mindset is not changing their minds, then we have to take a different approach at it and see how can we make them change their minds, or how can we become their counselors and their therapists and talk to them so they could really see us for who we are. So it's like, how can we reach that level to even talk to them on that level?
Well, look, your question raises a number of ideas or thoughts in my mind. First and foremost, I would first say to you that what I have learned over time is that people typically, well, first and foremost, those individuals that did that didn't do it out of ignorance, right? And so power only concedes to power, right? But the other thing that I would say to you in terms of people who unknowingly contribute to a system of oppression is that it's about how we frame the messaging of what we're trying to build. Most people are not afraid of change. Most people are afraid of loss. And so it's a matter of how you structure the narrative and build a narrative that our collective efforts or what we're trying to build to build social, social development goals is a structured gain for all of us. It creates safer communities, right? It creates more security for the future. That is important that we build that. Now, in terms of, those individuals who, contribute towards a system of oppression knowingly, it likely isn't a matter of them just growing a conscience, right? Because they're well aware of what they do. It's a matter of how you begin to become the change that you are seeking, right? How you begin to build institutions, because you need to be represented by the people who love you best or love you most, and that is you. And so when I'm talking about how you build cooperative enterprise, I'm talking about how community pulls its resources together in order to solve these problems. That is a more likely scenario of change than someone who's, making so much money that, they can't spend it in their lifetime or their children's lifetime, right? You have so many with so little and so few with so much, right? And that is a dynamic that should inherently raise alarms to us and say that is problematic. And I had another thing that I wanted to say to you, but it's slipping my mind. Forgive me. Thank y'all very much. It has been a pleasure to be with you. And I look forward to joining you again, and look forward to the work that is being engaged in with the Social Development Commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Lumumba.